Most people in the United States are not paying $1,300 a month for Ozempic. In fact, Wegovy, which is the obesity medicine version of Ozempic, most people that are on this are paying less than $25 a month. 80% of the people who are on this are paying $25 a month.
Is that with insurance?
That's with insurance, right? So you have the list price at $1,300, but most people in the United States are paying 80% are paying $25 or less.
You are tuned into the Dr. Tina Show with Dr. Tina Moore. For more, visit drtyna.com. On this episode of the Dr. Tina Show, I am excited for this one. I got to sit down and have a great conversation with my buddy, Dave Knapp. Dave and I met through the online space when I was deplatformed back in September for, I believe, talking about microdosing GLP-1s. He has built an entire platform called On the Pen, and his life's mission, he's become an independent journalist of sorts. That's not what his background was in, but he has made it his life's mission to connect people who are utilizing GLP-1 agonists. He is a man living with the disease of obesity, the disease of type 2 diabetes, and he knows this world well, and he's built this wonderful, expansive community of like-minded people who are all utilizing these peptides with life-changing impacts. He keeps us abreast on what's happening in the news, and so I brought him on today because I wanted you guys to get an update on what's happening with the FDA versus the compounding pharmacies and those ongoing trials and what's happening there, because the future of compounded GLP-1s may be in jeopardy. So I want you to get the inside scoop on that. He explains it so well. Whether you're on GLP-1s or care about them or not, this is a conversation you need to hear. Number two, we talk about the PBMs, which are the middlemen who are gouging us all and driving up prices of medications and pharmaceuticals. So that's something you guys need to know about as well. We talk about what it's like to live with the disease of obesity and what that means, and how he's gone keto. He's done the eat less, move more, how his community lives and the struggles that they have, and how these peptides have been absolutely life-changing for them, for leveling the metabolic playing field, as he calls it. And lastly, we even touch on a few things that we both agree MAHA may be missing the mark on. So without further ado, let's jump in. We get right into it. This is Dave Knapp. Hey, I got San Pellegrino too. We could be twinsies.
It would be apropos, yeah, except mine's in a plastic bottle.
Oh, well, there you go. Endocrine disruptor.
Yep, right. Gotta love it.
There you go.
I was like, faux pas right off the bat. So okay. I used to work at Olive Garden. That's sort of my history. Is I was a restaurant manager for literally from the time I was like 15 years old to the time that I was 28 years old. I managed restaurants, and one of my guilty pleasures when I worked at Olive Garden was, there's a lot of guilty pleasures working at Olive Garden, but they had glass bottles of San Pellegrino and glass bottles of Aqua Panna. That is such good spring water. And man, I probably drank my salary in fancy
Pellegrino.
Water. I worked at Olive Garden. But it's funny because, a lot of my journey to obesity, I think can be, obviously there's the genetic components. We have lots of stories or not stories, but we have lots of clinical trial data that bears out the fact that obesity there's a genetic component. There's a very genetic component to living with obesity. And then once you sort of get to the point where you have a lot of excess adiposity, as you talk about often, it is very hard to pull somebody back from that. And so the years that I spent in the restaurant industry, in the years I spent sort of on this roller coaster of dieting, was a huge contributing factor to my overweight condition and to ultimately developing type 2 diabetes. So back in, let's say about 2011, which I was probably about 25, 26 years old at the time, it was time to get out of the restaurant world. It was like 90 hours a week. It was horrible sleep schedules. I mean, just, you'd be there at 5 o'clock in the morning some days, some nights you'd be there till 1 or 2 a.m. And I wanted to start a family with my wife. Funny, the whole reason I got into restaurants is I was going to go into marketing, and I was dating my wife at the time who has rheumatoid arthritis, and accessibility is a huge issue with the Knapp family, because the one thing her parents said to me when I asked if I could marry her is they said, well, there can never be a gap in her health insurance or she loses access to her medicine. And at the time, this was a foreign world to me. They said the biologic she's on that keeps her arthritis at bay is $4,000 a month without insurance. And if there's ever any gap, she doesn't get that medication covered again. So this is all pre Affordable Care Act when they could sort of drop you from coverage if there was any sort of gap. And so I was like, man, I really want to marry this girl. So I better either go back to school or I better, figure out a way to get good health insurance. So I went to my manager at Olive Garden. I said, hey, I'm going to go back to school. And he goes, well, do you ever think about becoming a manager at Olive Garden? And I was like, no. No, I haven't. And he's like, well, here's the deal. Here's what we pay for. At the time, it was like a $60,000 a year salary. So for somebody who was like 20 years old at the time, and then he's like, full benefits, 401k. I was like, wait, what about that full benefits? Is that health insurance too? He's like, yeah. And so I literally was like, I'll do it. And within a couple of weeks, asked her parents to marry her. And then that set off for the first 8 years of our marriage. I worked in restaurants and just this obesity snowball, this down 25 pounds, up 35 pounds, down 25 pounds, up 35 pounds. The fettuccine Alfredo probably wasn't a helpful contributing factor to that either, but I wanted to get off this roller coaster. My father had done video production in the community that we live in for 25 years. And I stopped into his office one day on the way into an Olive Garden shift. And I was like, Dad, you got to help me get out of this. I've got the chops to do marketing. I'm passionate about it. What's out there? So I sort of repeat this, stopping into his office for a period of a couple of weeks. And I pop in one day. He's like, finally, I got something for you. It got me out of the restaurant industry. And I was about 6 months into that job where I was like, I want to just go talk to my dad today. I just felt this nudge. I was pumping gas. I can still remember it clear as day. I was pumping gas. It's like, why do I feel like I need to go see my dad? So I went to see my dad. And we had this big, long 2-hour discussion about everything from politics to the state of our family to the fact that I really wanted to do marketing. And so he sort of says, hey, I'll teach you what I'm doing from a video production side. You just have to sit with me a couple hours a week. And I was like, all right, let's do it. I got to get back to work. And so I'm walking out, I'm sliding his slider door shut, and he goes, don't forget this conversation, boy. And that's kind of how my dad was. I was like, all right, we'll see you later. To make a very long story short, those would be the last words my dad ever spoke to me. He died of a massive heart attack a few days later. He was 54 years old. It was obviously sudden and painful and traumatic and all of the things. But the last conversation that I had with him was rattling around in my brain for about 6 months. And ultimately, it led me to start a small marketing company. And that's sort of how I got into marketing. Now, it got me out of this restaurant cycle, but it didn't get me out of this obesity cycle. Just every year, down 25, up 35, down 25, up 35, until finally, it was the year of COVID. It was 2021. And I had COVID a couple of times, a couple positive tests from 2020 to 2021. I went into the doctor because I felt like I had long COVID. And I was just like, I'm tired every day. All I want to do is sleep. I don't know what's wrong with me. And he goes, oh, your A1C is a 7.9. You're diabetic.
Yikes.
I was like, what? It was like, literally, that was my response. I never had fasting glucose that showed that I was on the track to diabetes. So I felt like I was just punched in the gut. I knew that I was overweight. I knew that I had a family history, but I never had numbers that would indicate like, hey, you're on the fast track to type 2 diabetes. So it was like this sudden thing. And this is coming off COVID, right? And so I'm full of all sorts of skepticism towards medicine and the medical community. And I think that probably mirrors a lot of people's story. And he goes, what do you want to do, Dave? And I said, well, I've yo-yoed on keto for like 20 years. And that was the diet that I'd always lose 25, gain 35. He's like, well, that's the only way you can stay off medicine. I said, well, if it means staying off medicine, I'll do it. So I bared down, white knuckle, did keto for a full year. And I mean, I was under 20 grams of carbohydrates every day. I was lifting weights. I was doing everything humanly possible. With keto, I was able to get my A1C down from a 7.9 to a 5.3, non-diabetic, right? Really great. But my weight went from 319 to 312. I lost 7 pounds. And granted, some of it was there was probably some body composition change. I was lifting weights, but not what you would expect to see with somebody with that much weight to lose. So super frustrated, right? And just beyond frustrated. And the interesting thing at that time to me was that even though my A1C was under control with the diet, my insulin levels were still off the charts 12 months after being extremely strict on keto. Now, I had never really gone off the rails eating. I'm not a donut eater. I'm definitely guilty of drinking diet soda, but I'm not a sugary beverage drinker. Just not your typical who you would expect a 300-pound 37-year-old to eat, right? I generally ate lower in carbs anyway. I was aware that those probably weren't going to be handled by my body in the best way. So we're a year into the diabetes diagnosis, and he goes, you know what? I don't know. You're one of several people on this program out of 1,000 people that have gone through this program that just haven't responded from a weight loss perspective. And I was kind of like, I could have told you that when we started. But he goes, you're probably a candidate for bariatric surgery. And I'm going, I'm 37 years old. I don't want to have my anatomy rearranged. That's where my mental state was at the time. I'm not knocking anybody who makes that decision for themselves. And in fact, I'm still considering it at 39 years old, that actually might be the best course for me. I don't know. But still sort of wrestling with it is my point. But I didn't have coverage for it. So he goes, there's this new class of medications, right? They're actually mimicking what happens when people have bariatric surgery. We found that there are a bunch of hormonal changes that happen on the operating table. Once we make these changes, there's a hormonal regulation that starts to happen almost immediately. And they're starting to mimic that with this class of medications called GLP-1s. And so he goes, I'm going to put you on Mounjaro. It's expensive, but you're diabetic, so you should be able to get it covered. So I went home, again, still super skeptical of medicine in general, coming off of all the shenanigans that we saw around that time. And I'm like, I'm not going to just put this into my body. I'm going to learn everything there is to learn about this. And so I went to YouTube, and what I found from YouTube was a bunch of stories like, hey, I lost 100 pounds in 6 months on Ozempic, yada, yada. And there's 100 stories out there, but I didn't find anybody talking about what they were, what they did, how they worked, what the study showed. And I thought, I'm going to go find this information, but I'm going to share it because somebody else is going to come behind me, and they deserve to be able to find this information. And so that's sort of where On the Pen was born, is just this desire to empower people with information, right? And so essentially, this sort of has evolved as I've been a slower responder. I've seen many people in our community. We have probably 110,000 people we're spread out across the platforms, right? TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, email, Facebook, everything. But I've heard such dramatic stories about just massive transformations in weight loss, et cetera. It's just not been my story. So there's been sort of a level of frustration and wanting to know what else is on the horizon, what other things that I may be able to explore to treat my metabolic dysfunction. And so really what we do is we effort to share the news about these medications, the trial data that comes out, the whatever's going on in the news that might be pertinent to somebody whose life is being transformed by what I always call leveling the metabolic playing field. That's really, in essence, what these medications are doing for people who are taking them for type 2 diabetes or obesity, is they're actually just giving people a fighting chance for their biology to come into alignment in the sense that they can kind of work with the medication and bring themselves into better, more full, complete health for themselves. And one of the things that has been just the evergreen topic within this community is just the accessibility. They're extremely expensive medications to get unless you're diabetic. It's a little bit easier if you're diabetic, but then you have to you have to be diabetic to get it.
Right. You have to remain diabetic to continue to get it too, right? Like you have to remain obese or diabetic to actually have it clear. And that's the crazy part.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in insurance, that's the other thing that we've learned in the Knapp household is the insurance companies will fight you tooth and nail to not cover anything that is expensive. They're essentially practicing medicine, right? At the bureaucratic level of the insurance companies, they're just saying, yeah, there's something better here. And so ultimately, yeah, it's very difficult to stay on the medication as well as getting treatment for obesity. Once you're below a certain BMI, unless your doctor is coding everything just so, it's very hard to stay on it because now you're not obese anymore, but you need the medication for maintenance. Many people who are on these medications for obesity will need some level of treatment because like any chronic disease, typically when you need treatment to get it in remission, you need treatment to keep it there. And that sort of bears out in the clinical trials for these as well. That's not to say it's going to be everybody's story, but you're leveling the metabolic playing field with a peptide that is supplanting something that's deficient or dysregulated in your body. And so once you remove that, you're sort of fighting an uphill battle again. So the issue of accessibility has been this evergreen topic. I know that you talk about this within your community, many people relying on the compounded versions. Now, compound versions, I don't know how much you want to get into the weeds on this, but essentially pharmacies have been compounding medicines for hundreds of years. That's what they've done, right? But back in 2013, I believe it was, the government wanted to, realizing that we had some really glaring holes in the way that drug companies were sort of outsourcing active pharmaceutical ingredients and the manufacturing of their drugs. There was this gaping hole that left the United States open to drug shortages. And so it's like, what happens if all of a sudden we can't get antibiotics that are primarily made in China or India? What happens if we can't get those, right? And so they basically made a big distinction, and they said, we're going to have 503A pharmacies that have always been around. They can make a drug that is commercially available, not in shortage, but maybe a patient can't stand or is allergic to a certain preservative or a certain dye, or maybe even the doses that are available commercially don't work for that person. So compound 503A pharmacies always have the ability to make a branded medication in a compound form when there's a medical need that precipitates that. But they also, in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 2013, established another code that established 503B pharmacies. And basically this was to address that, what the lawmakers could see happening with the outsourcing of drug manufacturing was, if we all of a sudden, let's say there's something that happens on the economic stage of the world and we can't import drugs, we need infrastructure in the United States that can manufacture drugs that make sure people have what they need. And so in establishing 503B pharmacies, they established basically a pharmacy that's not like a traditional pharmacy. It's a factory. It is a plant that can mass produce medicines. And unlike 503As that have to hold an individual script for a patient, if a drug goes into an FDA shortage, they can mass produce it, right? And sort of fill in the gaps for where the drug manufacturers can't meet the demand or import enough, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these medications, because of their efficacy, because they are leveling the metabolic playing field, and because the disease of obesity and diabetes are so prevalent in the United States, these went almost immediately into shortage. People like me started making content about it. They haven't even really had to advertise these that much. Of course, everybody knows the Ozempic song, so they have been advertised to some extent. But once people really started to realize that these are absolute metabolic game changers, it's like everybody and their sisters on them. There's just no way these two drug companies have been able to keep up. So they've been in shortage. The problem with that system is that these are essentially a handshake agreement between Big Pharma and the FDA that says, yes, our drug is in shortage, or no, it's not in shortage. And so when October of 2024 hit, Eli Lilly reported to the FDA that Mounjaro and Zepbound, which tirzepatide, it's the probably the not probably it is probably the most powerful anti-obesity medication and type 2 diabetes medication on the market. It's like the next generation of Ozempic. They said our stuff is commercially available, which set off a chain reaction of stopping the 503B manufacturing. And there's upwards, I have direct contact with all the people that are kind of at the upper echelons of these industries. The estimated amount of semaglutide compound scripts that were made in 2023 was 80 million. 80 million scripts for compound semaglutide in 2023.
In 1 year.
In 1 year. Now, that's not 80 million people, that's 80 million scripts. So divide that by 12, and then you sort of get how many, prescriptions per year per people. But the other thing is, tirzepatide at that time is estimated to have been at about 30 million scripts. That's 2023. 2024, those numbers had to have jumped by conservatively 30%, probably more.
I'm sure I helped with that.
Yeah, right.
I was over there in 2024 going, compounding pharmacies, microdose.
Right. So conservatively in 2023, the estimate is that there were almost 30 million people on compounded tirzepatide. And so you can obviously see an increase happening in 2024 when this really blew up. I'm sure you had something to do with that, as well as many creators. And the interesting thing is I come from the TikTok world, right? And in the TikTok world, there are creators that are pushing compounded versions of medications that are making $20,000 a month pushing this stuff.
What?
It's
How?
huge.
Are they getting paid by the
huge money.
Okay, so I received $0 for any, just so that everyone knows, I've never been paid by any big pharma or compounding or telemedicine company at all. I refuse to take the dollars from them because I don't want there ever to be a conflict of interest. I'm just really trying to hang my hat on this one idea that I'm trying to get across. I'm not saying people who do are bad, but like how is that even happening? Like, how are they getting these kickbacks?
Yeah, it's crazy. So I would also just throw in me either. I am a advisor for a company called Row, which is a telehealth company that just simply wants somebody who represents the community to help them know what tools to develop and how to speak to the community, et cetera. But I haven't either because it all seems like a very legal gray area. But essentially, it's these telehealth companies have shared affiliate codes and they go on live and they share about the medication, what it's done for them. And if you want to do this for yourself, you can use my code, use code Dave10, whatever it may be. And then, ultimately, TikTok has such a far reach that people are getting people to sign up in the hundreds every month, receiving large kickbacks.
That's crazy. I've had so many companies offer me, I've turned down multiple. I probably turned down hundreds of thousands of dollars at this point from companies who really want to get me in with them. And I'm like, I just can't, even if they're good companies. I'm like, I can't do that. So anyway, go on.
Yeah. It's definitely a wild little sidebar rabbit hole to go down, but it all has, at the end of the day, what it's done is it is exponentially increased accessibility to these treatments, again, at an affordable rate, at an accessible rate, because these copies of the branded versions have been allowed to proliferate because the drugs are in shortage. But now that the drug companies, these pharmaceutical companies, have sort of had enough of their intellectual property being sort of usurped by this new sort of sector of the economy that has arisen, right? No drug has ever been compounded and mass produced the way that GLP-1s have. There's definitely pushback from big pharma. In that pushback, Lilly removed their medication from the shortage list, which set off a legal battle between the Outsourcing Facilities Association, basically a trade organization that represents 503Bs, these big outsourcing factories that have been able to mass produce these during the shortage. And they basically argued in court, what's going on to end the shortage and the data that is being shared is nothing more than what Lilly wanted to present to the courts the FDA, and the FDA's just gone along with it. Meanwhile, we have an estimated, between the 80 million and 30 million, 110 million prescriptions per year. You divide that by 12. I don't know. You get somewhere in the ballpark of what? 100,000 people, a million people on these, probably more people. And so it's very interesting to see this sort of unfold. Shortly after tirzepatide was removed from the shortage list, you saw Novo Nordisk follow suit, remove theirs. Interesting timing, right? And these are also two companies that have been sort of embroiled in lawsuits over price fixing over insulin. And so you kind of look at the template there, and it's very interesting to see how this is all unfolding, because you definitely have sectors of, I'm not saying this is my point of view, but you definitely have people out there saying this is the insulin fix 2.0 being done for GLP-1. Now, in fairness to both Lilly and Novo, they have both gobbled up about every ounce of manufacturing capacity that is to be gobbled up to increase production of the branded supply. Eli Lilly just announced a $27 billion investment in infrastructure in the United States to continue to increase their manufacturing capacity. And one of the things that I think is really amazing that Lilly has done in all this is they've repatriated the active pharmaceutical ingredient to the United States. So the active ingredient in Mounjaro will be made in Lebanon, Indiana. And so
interesting.
I think there are some positives to this. You've also seen, because of this sort of market that has popped up, and I don't even know how to let's call it big pharma, little pharma, right? This little pharma sort of market that has popped up in 503Bs, is it put pressure on Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk to reduce the cost of the prescription. So you always hear, like, how many times have you heard this? Well, we pay in America 5 times what they pay in Australia or the United Kingdom for these medications, right? That all has to do with the list price. Most people in the United States are not paying $1,300 a month for Ozempic. In fact, Wegovy, which is the obesity medicine version of Ozempic, most people that are on this are paying less than $25 a month. 80% of the people who are on this are paying $25 a month.
Is that with insurance?
That's with insurance, right? So you have the list price at $1,300, but most people in the United States are paying 80% are paying $25 or less. Now, why is that? We had the CEO of Novo Nordisk testifying on Capitol Hill that PBMs, which are the pharmacy benefit managers, they're the ones, for your audience, that are the ones that gatekeep what drugs you can have on your insurance plan. And they basically do this the way that Walmart sells a toaster, right? So Walmart wants to sell a toaster. They bring in 5 toaster manufacturers and they say, who can give us a $5 toaster? Because we're going to sell it for 15. And the one guy goes, well, it cost me 8 to make it. And so that person's option is either outsource his manufacturing to a foreign country where they pay slave labor wages, or they don't have a lot of choices. So whoever can bring them that $5 toaster gets added to the Walmart shelves, right? Same with the insurance formulary and the PBMs. The PBMs go, you want your anti-obesity medication on our formulary? Well, here's what you're going to pay us to have it there in the form of rebates. And so the testifying on Capitol Hill that the HELP committee ran, this is chaired by Senator Bernie Sanders, but it's a bipartisan committee in the Senate. And they brought up the CEO of Novo Nordisk, and, you got Bernie up there and he's like, why does it cost Americans 5 times what it costs Australians? And so, you get these great sound bites. And he basically said, if the PBMs are taking 70 cents on every dollar of every drug that we sell in the United States.
Oh, the PBMs are cents. Yeah, they're a racket. I have a whole podcast episode I did with Dr. John Kim about the PBMs. He's a pharmacist, and it's just crazy how corrupt the system is. The PBMs they got to go. They got to go. They got to go because what the Harvard study that was done, that gal found out that it costs them like $7 to manufacture a month's dose and a month's supply. I'm sorry, and that in Canada it's like $70, and maybe I might be getting my countries mixed up, but between the UK, Germany, and Canada, we're somewhere it's 150, somewhere it's 60. Like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah,
here in the
it's
US.
wild. And, not to get too far in the weeds, but essentially what happened during we talked a little bit at the beginning about the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act had some noble things it was pursuing, but like all noble things, like big money is always going to find a way around it, right? So, but what the Affordable Care Act did to insurance companies is it said you can't be more than 15% profitable, right? That was their way of sort of controlling this out of control rising cost of insurance premiums in this country. They said you can't be more than 15% profitable. You either have to put that money back in to expanding access or improving efficiencies within your business, but you can't be more than 15% profitable. So what did they do? Well, they decided we're just going to go buy the pharmacy benefit managers and we're going to change that game. And that's where we're going to make back the difference.
Yep.
And so, yeah, so what you've seen Eli Lilly and Novo do in response to this secondary market that has popped up to ultimately has it increased accessibility because there's shortages? Absolutely. It has fulfilled its dutiful responsibility as designed within the code of the US law. But what it's also done is it's added a level of competition that usually doesn't exist for drugs that are under a patent. And because it did this, it forced Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk to look at this a different way. So what they decided to do is they decided to say, we're going to cut out the PBMs altogether, which is actually a very bold move for pharmaceutical companies to make, because pharmaceutical companies have always seen PBMs as their customers, right? We sell to the PBMs. The PBMs then put it on the formularies and doctors prescribe it based upon what's on the formulary. How many times have you gone to the doctor, people who are watching, and the doctor says to you, let's see, you have this, so here's the 4 or 5 antibiotics I could prescribe, and this is the one your insurance company likes. They like it because they get kickbacks, right? They decided to just go around them altogether. And so now Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk both have direct-to-patient programs that offer a cash pay price that just cuts insurance out of the whole deal. And they charge $400, and basically it's a little bit more convoluted than this, but for all intents and purposes, it's $499 a month for all the doses of Wegovy, and up to the 10 milligram of Zepbound, which is the weight loss version of this one, $499 a month, right? For the single dose vial versions. They've done this because they're able to then forget about what the PBMs have to get paid in this, and they just offered a direct cash pay price for $499. Still a lot higher.
There's no more pharmacists in the middle of this. This is the doctor prescribing straight to Big Pharma and Big Pharma fulfilling the order. Is that correct?
Correct. In a sense, yeah. So it's a little.
That's novel too. That's quite novel.
It is. There is a little bit of a middleman. In that they have partnered with telehealth companies to if you don't just go to Eli Lilly, you got to go to, well, I guess now it's a little bit different. You can go to anybody and they can prescribe these vials. And yes, it comes directly from essentially the manufacturer by way of some, like Amazon Pharmacy, I think is offering the Lilly vials now. So there is a distribution element to it, kind of. But yeah, by and large, yeah, it's a novel approach by Big Pharma to go direct to patients. And actually just this week, there was a letter sent from some senators. I think it was a bipartisan letter sent to some of the telehealth companies that Lilly Direct and NovoCare, that's these two direct to consumer programs, and basically gone to their partners, their telehealth partners, and said, we think there might be a conflict of interest that you're pushing people to your drug. We want to look closer at this. But yes, it did create a novel sort of approach. Now, the sad part about it, to me, I mean, I think it's great. Competition, great. Cheaper drugs for people, great. Especially because, people on Medicare are just screwed out of this stuff. They don't, Medicare, it's illegal for obesity medication to be covered under Medicare. Now they're getting some secondary sort of comorbidities that have been approved for cardiovascular disease, with heart disease with preserved ejection fraction, sleep apnea, some of these backdoor indications to get you on it if you're on Medicare. But by and large, it's illegal for Medicare to cover anti-obesity medicine, because going back to the obesity medicines of old, what were they? They were amphetamines, basically.
Yeah.
The last thing they wanted to do was give a 75, 80-year-old person an amphetamine,
Speed.
and have them drop it.
Right.
So it's a bit of an archaic law that there are some things trying to correct. The Biden administration moved at the end of their administration to sort of add it, and hopefully the Trump administration picks that up. But there are some positive things. I think the sad part is the PBMs have been squeezing out our local pharmacies for the last 20 years, roughly 17 years. They've been squeezing them out by way of not reimbursing them the appropriate rate. So, for example, if you're going to fill your Manjaro at a local pharmacy, chances are they're losing $25 to $50 every time they fill that script.
Yeah, and let's just talk about that for a moment. I have friends in the pharmacy industry who tell me this, and it's gotten to the point where they're simply unable to sustain that. So, I mean, it's just impossible. So this is a big problem, is that they're just choosing not to stock it, period. So when people call to re-up, they're like, sorry, we don't have it in stock, and we'll never have it in stock because we're losing so much money. Like, why would they? Why would anyone participate in a backwards model like that? It's crazy.
Right. And not to even make mention of the fact that, so a local pharmacy, a mom and pop corner shop who is serving their community, in some cases have been serving the community for 75 years, longer. They have to cut these deals with the PBMs because typically you go to any town in the USA, there's one large employer. They're going to carry United Healthcare or Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Humana, whatever it may be. You have to take that PBM's insurance in order to be in business. But what they do it's so evil what they do to these pharmacies is one of the things that most people don't know is that if you go to the pharmacy for, let's say, a generic medication, they're going to default they're contractually defaulted to run it through your insurance. And sometimes you're going to pay more with your insurance than you would to just pay the cash pay price. So one little word to the wise is always ask your pharmacy, what's my cash pay price versus running it through insurance? Because you might be like, well, I trust my pharmacy. Why don't they just tell me it's cheaper? Because they're contractually obligated not to tell you that.
Supposedly, they're not even supposed to tell you there's a cash pay price if you have insurance. They are. So, and I had this happen to me recently. I went in for just like an antifungal medication, and it was so awkward, Dave. Like right before she filled it, I walked up and I had a GoodRx coupon, and I said, you guys can go to goodrx.com and print off coupons, and there's always great coupons for drugs. And I went up and I said, okay, so I have this, and I think it came to like 17 something. And she goes, oh, well, and it was an older lady, and she said, oh, well, our cash pay is only like 12. And I said, okay, great, let's do that. And then this young girl comes up and literally shoves her aside and looks at me and goes, do you have an insurance coverage? And I said, I just got an insurance with my husband, but it's Kaiser. It's garbage. I don't think that like this is going to cover. It's a non-Kaiser doctor prescribing it. And she's like, we need to check. And so she checks it. And when it's all done, it comes back as this stupid price. And they use the GoodRx coupon, and I have to pay the 17 instead of the 12. And I looked at the older gal like, this is insanity. That like, this is crazy. And that's a whole other thing, because I will tell you what, this happens in the medical industry as well. Like this is happening inside of doctors' clinics every single day. I never took health insurance ever. I've always existed on payment at time of service practice, because I don't think we should get third parties involved in our healthcare or our car care or any other care. And complete transparency, give a patient an estimate, tell them exactly what it's going to cost. If I veer outside of that more than $100, I agree to eat it. And like, I eat the cost if I have to. And like, that is the kind of transparency I function on, because I cannot believe what medicine has turned into. And not only in my lifetime, because I was a really sick child. So I was always in and out of doctor's offices. And I remember when my mom, blue-collared mom, could write a check to the specialist and it would be affordable, to now where we've gotten to, especially since Obamacare kicked in on this side as the physician and as someone who never even took insurance, but just has kept up. Like, it's insane and corrupt. It is organized crime, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's legalized corruption.
Yeah, it's crazy. So back to the GLP-1. So access is obviously an issue. The compounding pharmacies have come in and filled a need. And what is your opinion, about this lawsuit? So let's back up to this OFA organization that's fighting the FDA. Eli Lilly, from what I've learned from you and your very comprehensive reporting, you guys follow Dave, it's onthepen.com. It's on the pen. What is it on all the different platforms? You've got like on the pen or man on the pen on Instagram.
Yeah, I think if you just go to Google and just hit on the pen, you're going to find it, or onthepen.com, you should find it. But Man on the Manjaro was my handle. That's sort of, it was a play of Man on the Moon. And
yeah, I like it.
My handle in most places is Man on the Manjaro.
But Eli Lilly jumped in on the FDA side on this lawsuit about tirzepatide, and didn't Novo Nordisk as well jump in? And then isn't there a separate now lawsuit going between Novo and the OFA about semaglutide since it went off shortage? Yeah, so it's crazy. And then you said recently, you tried to explain something I didn't understand about the judge. Tell him about the judge, first of all, who he is and what his history is. And then what was this recent thing? There was like a letter or something he denied. I don't know what it means.
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack here. When the OFA originally brought this case, the OFA, which again is a trade organization that represents these big manufacturers of compound drugs that are produced in times of shortage, they are located in Fort Worth, Texas. In Fort Worth District Court, there is a judge. His name is Judge Mark Pittman. And Judge Pittman has been a absolute, I think he's just been great with some of his rulings against the FDA and Big Pharma. One in particular was just in early December, over the COVID vaccine from Pfizer. And the FDA had kind of had this sort of handshake with Pfizer that they wouldn't release documents pertaining to adverse effects of the vaccine for like 40 years or something like that.
Oh, it was longer than that.
40 or 70 or something.
Yeah, it was like 75 years. It was crazy.
Yeah, it was ridiculous, right? And so he comes in and he goes, no, you're going to start releasing 50,000 pages a month immediately.
So he's the reason Pfizer had to release the documents.
Yeah.
So he's a hero.
Yeah, so there really couldn't have been a better venue or a better judge. Like on the surface, I don't pretend to know like all the judges and all that. I don't any judges before I got into this stuff. But when I saw that, I was like, oh, this is our guy, right?
Yeah.
This is the guy who
track record.
needs to
Good track
understand
record.
the need, right? And so if anybody was going to sort of see that there is like something inherently wrong with the fact that there's no transparency in this process, that the FDA is just relying on reported numbers from Eli Lilly, that there's got to be some kind of conflict in there, right? Like even if everything's on the up and up, let's say, there's still something wrong with that process where that's the only information that gets, sort of taken into consideration by the FDA to determine that the drug's commercially available. So the tirzepatide lawsuit has not evolved the way that I maybe thought it would based upon the judge, but we actually had a correspondent sit in on the one physical hearing that took place, and he kind of gave me a call afterwards, gave me the rundown. He goes, this judge is extremely annoyed by the fact that this is even in his courtroom. He knows that whatever the outcome, it's going to an appeals court, and he just doesn't think it belongs in this venue. Well, that didn't play well for compound tirzepatide. It didn't bode well for the case for people who were relying on that mass-produced peptide. And it's sort of played out that way. He denied the preliminary injunction last week, which essentially would have protected compounders until this trial was resolved. He denied that. And then he actually went one step further and moved for a summary judgment, which essentially means both sides are going to get a couple weeks to respond back and forth to his declaration of a summary judgment, and then he's just going to rule. There won't even be a trial, witnesses, whatever. He just wants it out of his court. As luck would have it, he's the one who drew the subsequent lawsuit that was filed by the OFA against the FDA in the semaglutide shortage. So he's overseeing that case as well. It was a little interesting at first. Novo tried to interject their local, they have to have local representation, and they're a Danish company. So they hired a guy outside of the jurisdiction, and so he kind of slapped him down initially, but Novo was eventually able to join that lawsuit, just like Lilly joined the tirzepatide lawsuit to defend the FDA's decision. And so it's the OFA versus the FDA and Lilly, and the OFA versus the FDA and Novo. And so it's not going to bode well. Both of the mass-produced compound versions will be going away. The OFA filed an appeal in the Fifth Circuit, but that will take a long time to resolve, and it's unclear whether the Fifth Circuit will do anything to sort of stay enforcement. So my prediction of what's going to happen is you're going to see the mass compounding go away of both tirzepatide and semaglutide, everybody's going to move back to these 503As, which from my perspective is just, there's a spectrum here, right? There's a spectrum of non-branded medications. The big pharmaceutical companies would want you to believe that all non-branded are created equal. They're just not, right? So 503Bs are subject to the current goods and manufacturing process. Long way of saying they have FDA oversight. When you move to 503As, and that's kind of what we explained earlier, where you take the active ingredient and then you do it in a dose that isn't available commercially, or you add B12 because somebody has, fatigue or whatever it may be. Niacinamide's another one gets added a lot. So basically, there's something that's not commercially available because there's a medical need precipitating it. I think they're sort of operating outside of the spirit of why 503As exist, right? Because all of a sudden they're going to move millions of people who are on normal dosages, just exact copies of the branded medication, to these custom formulations. Prescribers are going to run into problems with the FDA, I believe. The other thing is,
compounding pharmacies or the prescribers?
I think both will be on the receiving end of something. I think prescribers, potentially, I think, the industry is preparing itself for the FDA to come and sort of stick their nose into the way these are being prescribed. But we definitely know that both Novo and Lilly are putting out cease and desist letters to compound pharmacies, to providers, to telehealth companies. Everybody's getting them. And so once this March 19th is the cutoff, that's just coming right around the corner. March 19th hits, that has to end. And then you'll see massive movement legally from Lilly. Novo Nordisk is like a month behind. And so semaglutide will be about a month behind that. All the telehealths are saying we're moving to custom formulations. It remains to be seen how they will respond in the face of legal threats and the legions of attorneys and lawyers that will be dispatched to basically squash anything that is not the branded version, not to mention the FDA. What remains to be seen too is like what's the appetite of this administration moving to enforce anything against these compounders. That we don't know, but we do know that, Trump has about 27 billion reasons why from Eli Lilly this past week as to why they would go ahead and try to help enforce non-legal, at least in their version, at least from their position, non-legal prescribing of compounds.
I think Trump might be on a GLP-1.
I
can tell. Well, I can tell when people are like, oh, they'll secretly tell me. There's so many people online. There's so many influencers, and there's so many people online that you would never guess that are on GLP-1s. And they're like, oh, I just cut carbs from my diet, or I just did this. And I'm like, yeah, honey, I know. I can tell. I can see it in people now. I can, especially tirzepatide. Well, the tirzepatide just takes the inflammation down so fast. And so I can just see it. But anyway, I really do firmly think that Trump he used to be much heavier. I think he's on a GLP-1. I think that's how he got through this. I'm just speculating. I don't know. Don't get me in trouble, Trump. But I think I think watching this whole campaign, I was like, that's just my opinion.
We know that his best buddy Elon he's openly said
Definitely
that he's taking Ozempic, and I believe Manjaro even now. And they're, from the perspective of this, if you're just going by the numbers, a good percentage of people within his cabinet have probably been on a GLP-1 also. So I don't think that the benefit of these drugs has escaped them at all. It'll just be interesting to see what the appetite for the FDA to actually enforce this stuff.
So that's what it's going to come down to.
Yeah, the custom formulations. I talked a little bit how there's a spectrum, right? So 503Bs have the 503B pharmacies have the CGMP that is overseen by the FDA. The 503As don't. So 503A pharmacies are overseen by their state pharmacy boards. So when you start, for anyone who's switching to a 503A, a custom formulation or a custom dose in the interim, I would really strongly encourage you to know what pharmacy it's coming from, and then do some research on the state pharmacy boards and make sure that they're a pharmacy in good standing. Because again, there are different checks and balances for 503Bs that don't exist for 503A. And then way over here, you have the research grade peptides that are available in the far reaches of the internet without a doctor's prescription, that are labeled not for human consumption, right? So there's a spectrum of safety checks and balances that are built into the non-branded versions. And so when you're talking about that spectrum, they're just simply not all created equal. So the ironic thing about this is the crusade that Lilly and Novo have against compounded versions, their actions are actually leading people to progressively less potentially safe options.
I
right?
couldn't agree more. It's just bizarre. I get it. I get where they're coming from, but man, it is well, to get back to your point of this 120 million people or 120 million prescriptions that are coming out, and that was in 2023 before this all went bonkers in 2024. I've seen you say on your platforms that like, show us that you can prove, and I think this is the argument of the OFA, is that show us you can prove, like, sure, you say it's off shortage. Can you actually make up for all of these? Can you actually cover all of these extra ones that are going around through the compounded world? I mean, that's 120 million prescriptions. Do you guys have enough bandwidth to cover that? And, who knows if they do. You're right. They are buying, I've been following it too. They're buying up huge facilities. And I think I probably learned that from you. I just keep up with all my GLP-1 news from you guys, or from you and your platform. And I know it's predominantly just you doing all of this heavy lifting. So, and you have a day job too. So you're just a valuable resource in this world. Thank you for what you're doing, because I think that people need to know, and a lot of people are flying blind, and you've taught me a lot. And I think that it's a real pickle, because you're right. 503B is different than the other version. And I do know many compounding pharmacists who run very clean ships, and their facilities are clean and spectacular. And before this all went down, what year was that? Did you say 2013? When did the 503B come in?
Yeah, that established 503Bs, I believe it was 2013, 2011 or 2013.
So I remember that happening when I was in clinical practice, and it has always been a source of confusion, because many of the things we could have compounded that were injectable suddenly went to that. And so we could no longer, we used to be able to order whatever we wanted for in-office use, and then it changed. And now with 503B, you have to prescribe to a patient specifically. Even if you have it shipped to the office and administer it in the office, it has to be by patient name. Anyway, it created a lot of confusion. And I know that for a fact that the compounding pharmacies have been on the receiving end of severe witch hunts for decades. And so they are constantly being scrutinized. And if one compounding pharmacy in the whole United States screws up, it's like headline news. And suddenly, and it could be a big deal though. I mean, there's been deaths when injectable substances get contaminated with a fungus, and those happen to be being injected into people's spinal cords. I mean, we can have real problems. So I get it. But at the same time, that doesn't, they just paint it all as all compounding pharmacies are evil and terrible and bad. And my friends who are compounding pharmacists are the most OCD, clean. I mean, they have whole specialized rooms that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to build so that they can make injectables, and they go in like the full hazmat. It's a whole thing. And they're always constantly stressed out and worried that the FDA is just going to come in and shut them down. And then what do you do? So that said, I'm not as worried about them going back to the 503A, but yes, you are totally correct in what you said. And I'm so glad you said it, because it's just a different thing that's happening between.
Yeah. And there's definitely nothing wrong with 503A. It's just that there's not uniformity in the way that they're governed. And so one state to another state has different rules. And the other thing that I would add too is, you should have a great level of confidence from your provider. If your provider is writing this script, it really is incumbent upon your provider to do the legwork in determining, am I sourcing this from an appropriate place? There was a story back in the last few months when this first came off shortage, tirzepatide in October. Many telehealths, a lot of the littler fly-by-night telehealth companies that are out there started offering, you could fill 6 months, 9 months, 12 months of compounded medication in one fell swoop. And I was like, when that happened, I was like, slow down, everybody. Like, slow down. We're not sure, like, these don't have the same exact preservatives as the branded medications do. You're sitting with a year's worth of medicine in your refrigerator. You better make sure that your refrigerator is holding a steady temperature. That's a lot of medicine to sit on when you're putting it in your body. And one of the interesting things that happened was there was a couple of them that started offering this right away from some fly-by-night compound pharmacy in Florida that ended up not having a sterile compound license. And they were getting their peptides in from unnamed sources and then sending them out to people, and they didn't even hold the proper license to do it. And so I think more than anything, it's important to have a great relationship with your provider. If your provider understands this, if your provider has done the legwork, then you should have full faith and confidence in what they prescribe to you. But when we go from 503Bs that are governed and regulated by the CGMP, which means that all the API has to be sourced from FDA approved sources, et cetera, you're just moving to something that's state governed. And so you just want to be familiar with what sort of regulations go on in the state that your medicine's coming from. And then just familiarize yourself with what that pharmacy's history has been, because everybody's getting into this game.
That's the Wild West.
What we learned is even some people that don't belong in it. So that would just be my only word of caution.
It's turning into the Wild West for sure. I have a whole module inside my big course where I talk about how to find a practitioner to work with or how to educate your practitioner. That's why I open this course up to the public, is because I want people to become educated and empowered so they can have these conversations. And I will add this, I will make sure everyone listens to this episode and hears that, because I think this is a really important piece of the puzzle. I get asked a lot online from people like, my doctor just prescribed me this, is it safe? And I'm like, talk to your doctor. I mean, if you don't trust your doctor, who do you trust? You some random online influencer? You know, like, I mean, I'm glad you trust me, but don't be asking me stuff. You should be asking your doctor. And then the second piece is, I do have a whole list of pharmacies that I trust that I list off inside that course too, so that people can, and even some telehealth, I'm going to be adding some different companies I've vetted out, because I just think this is turning into the Wild West for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got that's a great update on the lawsuits that are happening. So that was my next question, was what do you think the future holds for compounded? And I think you answered with, they might go back to the 503A, and then who knows what's going to happen from there. And I guess it depends on if the FDA actually enforces. It's crazy right now. I don't even know who is going to be running the FDA here. We still haven't gotten confirmation. So I don't know what's happening.
I think a lot of us were bullish on Dr. Marty Makary, who is, been nominated to head up the FDA. I think he's already gone through some of the back and forth on Capitol Hill even. He was the chief medical officer of Sesame Health, which is a huge prescriber of compounded GLP-1 medications. And so I think a lot of us were bullish on that. But, TBD, right?
Well, and to be honest with you, I have seen a lot of bias come out of the MAHA movement around GLP-1s. That's been I've seen RFK literally parrot words from Callie Means, and words that I corrected Callie Means on. If you haven't seen that interview on Mark Hyman's podcast, I debated Callie Means about a year ago, and April of last year. And I didn't really get to debate much because he was that's
the lion's den.
He was railroading me the whole time, but I corrected him on some facts that he had wrong, and he continues to spread that misinformation. And then I've seen RFK parrot it, and I've seen a lot of bias around these peptides come out of the MAHA movement. And I love the MAHA movement. I love several people in it, but I do not understand the blatant, Callie was on a bender about GLP-1s, and I to this day don't understand it. I think the argument there that is somewhat valid is if Medicare covers this, or certain states have been talking about covering it, it could bankrupt the system with the costs being what they are currently. But I think the administration needs to bring the cost down, because these are life-saving peptides and complete game changers.
They need to be able to arbitrate the cost, and bring the cost of these medications down when they're purchasing them in bulk through Medicare or Medicaid. I think the other thing, to kind of jump back on, well, first of all, the Medicare thing, you think about this, they find the money for absolutely everything else. When we talk about bankrupting anything, it's pretty crazy to think what our government spends money on. And then when it comes to something like this that could literally change the course of the history of the United States by righting this broken metabolic ship that we've created, is just so short-sighted. But the other thing that I think that
So
we see,
short-sighted.
yeah. The other thing that I think we see in the MAHA movement where they have it wrong is that just like everything politically, we've been given this false dichotomy. It's like we have to switch oils to beef tallow, and we have to get the dyes out of the Fruit Loops, and like all good endeavors, like let's clean up the toxic food environment. But what do we do for people who are already sick?
Yeah.
And that's the part of the conversation that seems to get, well, what are we just going to tell them to eat less and move more? That's been a real winning strategy for the last 40 years.
Yeah.
If we could just embrace a little bit of the science that we know about broken metabolism, hormonal dysregulation, and maybe we can embrace getting sick people the treatment that they deserve. And then at the same time, like we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? We can clean up the food environment, and we can address people that are getting sick. And oh yeah, by the way, if you want to bring down the cost of GLP-1s, why don't we let 503Bs continue to compound this and actually look at the fact that Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly will never be able to meet the demand of 100 million people in the United States alone that are living with the disease of obesity, not to mention type 2 diabetes. If we're just honest about their capacity to meet that problem, then 503Bs should be able to let the 503Bs cook. That's what I keep saying.
Yeah.
Like, that's why we created them. We created them to fill a shortage. Now, if they just a deeper look at this issue and made sure that this was happening on the up and up, I think we may have a different outcome.
Oh, that was so well said. I agree with all of it. I also think at the end of the day, we're looking at symptoms. They're looking at chemicals in ultra processed foods and how they should be changed so that there's not so many chemicals in the ultra processed food. And I'm over here saying we have a metabolic disaster on our hands. We shouldn't be eating the ultra processed foods in the first place. Like, why don't we teach people? I'm thinking Jack LaLanne. Like, why is there not a US-wide national television show every morning where people learn how to eat? This should have started in March of 2020. I was like, put me on the news. Get me a morning show. I will get everybody through this pandemic. We need to be subsidizing gym memberships. We need to be, and I know based on your story, like I know that's not the end all be all, but again, we stack, like we got to stack the things, and we need the muscle. We need people to learn how to lift the weights. Like there's so many other things we could be worrying about that I almost feel like it's a distractor. Talking about like the chemical dyes and Fruit Loops and the seed oils is almost a distractor in the grand scheme of things. The light poisoning, I was just on your podcast talking about how I think we're being poisoned by light and how that's leading to a metabolic crisis. Like there's so many, like why did the Biden administration outlaw incandescent light? Like what an utter disaster that is for people's metabolic health and circadian rhythm to be poisoned all day under LEDs. And yet those are some things that I would like to just propose to MAHA that we start actually looking at, because those are the real needle movers. And getting we don't need to switch up some ingredients and some shitty foods. We need to completely overhaul the school lunch system and actually feed these kids real food and have that whole thing subsidized. All the kids get to eat the real healthy food in the school lunches because that might be the only place they're getting it, right? So there's so many bigger fish to fry here that it's like arguing over Fruit Loops from Canada versus the US just seems short-sighted.
It's nonsensical. It creates nice little soundbite clips. But one of the things, and I realize we've gone a little long here, but if I may, one of the things that I started sort of shifting towards in 2025 for On the Pens, I said, I kind of gave the history of how we started and sort of what we become, but we've gotten a lot of media attention over the last year and a half. I mean, we were in a Fortune magazine article right next to Eli Lilly in a big expose about them. We've been featured in Bloomberg and Fortune magazine. I'm heading out to do a health.com piece in New York City this weekend. Like we've had a lot of opportunities that I just never would have imagined were going to come my way. And I was like, we're not going to go into 2025 just awestruck with the opportunity we have. We're going to be ready to actually advocate for some things. And one of the things that I've been advocating for with the change of this administration is, why are we not taking obesity as serious, every bit as serious as we took the coronavirus? because this is an
Amen.
epidemic that has national security implications. It has economic implications. It has health implications. It has societal implications. We need to advocate for this administration and the next administration, whoever it may be, to take obesity serious. And so that's why one of the things I've been advocating for is like this, not that Operation Warp Speed was some great template, but in the sense that it was an all of government approach to figuring out how to navigate a problem. We need an all of government approach to figuring out how we're going to eradicate the disease of obesity. And that comes from everything from figuring out how to get the cost of these medications down, figuring out how to get shots in the bodies of every single metabolically ill person who could benefit from them, and really starting to correct this course. And you touched on one of the things. Why isn't there some sort of subsidization of health and fitness programs?
Yeah,
why aren't
just
we
health.
reforming the SNAP system? Why aren't we protecting compound pharmacies to do what we set out for them to do? Why aren't we implementing bulk buying programs under Medicare and Medicaid to get the cost of these down? Why aren't we just rethinking this system as a whole? And instead, like you said, we're focusing on frickin' Fruit Loops. Like who even eats Fruit Loops anymore?
Well, I will tell you, Dave, in 2020, when I pushed back on the narrative, I was predominantly promoting sunlight, exercise, and real food. And I cannot tell you the level of censorship I endured. I can't even believe it now. And nobody believed me at the time because they weren't brave enough to speak out at the time. So they were not being censored like I was. And I was seeing it happen. And I'd been online long enough to see it. I could see it happening to me. And very few other people were actually having that message that were being censored. Most people were like pushing back on lockdowns, pushing back on mandates, pushing back on vaccines. Yes, I later was pushing back on that as well. But initially, the bots that came at me and the initial pushback I got were so bizarre. And I started getting censored deeply every time I mentioned the word obesity. If I even opened my mouth or any of my title cards or anything said obesity in the caption or on the screen or on the post, I was heavily censored and I would be dropped into severe shadow bans. I don't think they want it. Oh, and then let's just add, I was deplatformed the first time at 105,000 off of Instagram a month after I was on RFK's podcast talking about how obesity was driving the pandemic, in my opinion. And I made a very good argument for how this virus preferentially infects fat cells and what was happening there from a metabolic standpoint, and how our metabolic crisis was driving this, and how we could quell this significantly in 90 days if we started helping people with their metabolic health. And here comes this peptide that has such an enormous impact. Like you said, leveling, I love what you said, leveling the metabolic playing field. And lo and behold, I get the same pushback that was almost identical when I started talking about them. So I think you're probably under a constant shroud of censorship. You just don't realize it yet because you're being probably suppressed across all platforms. That's just my opinion. But trust me, watching the censorship and pushback that I got that was orchestrated and concentrated on me specifically, and several others in the community, like most notably the carnivore movement, anything that we try to do to help with obesity is squashed, which leads me to believe, and again, my opinion, that they prefer us slow, sick, fat, and dumb. We are easier to control when we are unwell, and the diabetes industrial complex is a massive moneymaker. So I think that we're looking at a very strange uphill battle that you may not even know the enemy in front of you. But you got your book taken down, right? Talk about that. You have this great book, and Amazon, I had just bought it, and then thank God, and then Amazon pulled it.
Yeah, so I wrote a book. It's called Decoding GLP-1. It's a guide for friends and family of people using anti-obesity medication, specifically GLP-1. One of the big things that really became apparent right away to me once I started building community was that there were so many people on these medications that, because of the stigma around obesity and the shame and the guilt and everything that people are led to believe about themselves, even though people with obesity, I would argue most of my community are people who have more gumption, more stick-to-itiveness, more drive, because they have to do something we've been working against our biology. So we have to fight, and we're fighting like a losing battle all the time. So we're fighting against something that we know is probably not even going to work out in our favor, but we fight and we fight and we fight, even though we don't see the external like rewards. Yeah, I wrote this for those people to empower them to have conversations with those people in their life who they love and felt like they couldn't have these conversations with. And then boom, all of a sudden, about 2 months into this, I had a lot of velocity behind the book, all organic. There's no publisher. I wrote it. I released it. I released it to my community for that purpose. Like they were eagerly anticipating it. So it did well. We're at the top of it. We were right next to Dr. Jason Fung and the diabetes code. And yeah, they just wiped it out one day and told me it was, I can't even remember at this point. It was wild. It was like your book violates our community terms. And, this, meanwhile, there are like 100 different GLP-1 books out there, many of them towing the line on what should be acceptable and not, but mine was singled out. Thankfully, our community, like I gave them the little portal that I had to contest it. And I was just like, you go there and contest it too. And so they started getting hundreds of emails from 100 different directions. And I think finally they just went, all right, screw it. We'll put it back up. But yeah, thankfully we got it back. But yeah, I mean for the last 3 or 4 months, every video I put out on TikTok goes into, this holding pattern before it's even posted, like reviewing my content. And it's like, who's reviewing it and for what? I talk about the news. 99% of the videos that I put out, I'm just talking about what we talked about here today. Here's the news. The OFA is suing the FDA. This is what the judge said today. Or a clinical trial just dropped and this is the top line data that we got. Or there's a new drug in development and this is what it's called and this is who's making it. That's literally what I do. I'm not out there saying controversial things. I'm just simply reporting the news. Now, I've given a little bit more of my opinion today on this podcast, but I've given way more opinion today than I usually do on my podcast. So, yeah, I do believe that there's a narrative out there and that if you step outside of that, you don't even, like you said, you don't even know sometimes who that enemy is, what they're doing, but you definitely feel it. And it's hard sometimes to stick to it when you've sort of given your life's work. And it's not just me who has given up things. It's my family. It's time away from them. I'm a sick kid out here, like we are sacrificing, our families are sacrificing so that we can give people information that's going to help them live better lives. And we believe in the mission. So when it's tamped down by the powers that be, it can be a very frustrating place to be.
It is.
Nobody knows that better than you.
Yet we persist, right? Because I think a lot like you, and it's just tenacity, and I refuse to let them break me. So I will continue to persist. But I do think we are stumbling into a bit of a hornet's nest without realizing it here with our content around this. And I do think it's because they don't necessarily want us healthy. That's why I'm excited for the MAHA movement. I'm excited for what RFK can accomplish. I wish him the best. But I think we're up against Goliath, and it's a much bigger, much broader umbrella than we even realize. And I may never know it, but we are easier to control.
He's got a ways to go on this topic. For sure.
He sure does. I wish he would give.
He needs to tune out the Jillian Michaels and the Callie Means of the world and actually embrace some people who've lived with this disease. I'm so sick of hearing from people who've never lived with obesity that the same old mantra of eat less and move more is the solution to this. If it were the solution, we wouldn't be in this position. And I know that because I live with it. And I know that I've lost probably over 500 pounds in my lifetime. But the problem is my biology is working against me. And the second that I'm not living in a constant state of complete denial of entire food groups or entire life is devoted to being in a gym, which as a father of 4 and 2 jobs and everything, like just if the only way for me to move the needle is to live in a way that is completely unsustainable for me. Yeah. And I think if people actually understood that and lived in the shoes of somebody that has lived with severe metabolic illness, they would start to understand why that old mantra is so ineffective. And we need sick people need treatment. And that's exactly what these peptides are doing. And they're only getting better. Right. And as they get better and better, like more and more people will find hope and treatment and healing. But we have to have people at the upper echelons of the government that actually understand that and embrace it instead of listening to these people who have maybe larger platforms, but have no effing clue what it's like to live with a metabolic disease.
Or maybe they have an agenda as well, So when I see people hating on Ozempic, I'm like, what are you selling? And it
Yeah.
usually adds up. So
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that. And I will add that this is comprehensive. The pen isn't going to be the fix. These peptides are not the solo fix. And I think that's where I get a lot of pushback from my audience is, well, they can't hear me when I say comprehensive. And that is what I practice, and that is what I preach, and that is what I teach inside my courses and inside my content is comprehensive. Like, we have to do all the things and we stack them because when you go deep into the biochemistry of it, they all favor each other and they all potentize each other, and they potentize the peptide. They actually literally make the peptide work better and more efficiently, and we can keep the dose lower when we do all the things. And most of all the things are the things that we just need to be doing as human beings. They're not costs. They're not extra. I mean, they might be extra time, but they're lifestyle. It's not like this is some elite strategy that only rich people can afford, Right. As long as we can keep those peptides affordable. And I think through the help of some of these telemedicine companies, because there are some very good ones, the real onus of responsibility always will ultimately land on the individual. That's not saying we can't help them and give them a leg up, but man, if the administration really wants to move the needle on you are so right on this obesity crisis. And it is what is driving the sheer bulk of deaths in this country are from cardiovascular disease. Category number 2 is cancer. And then for a few years running, COVID was number 3. I would argue that all 3 of those are obesity related and driven for the most part, or metabolic compromise driven. You can be rail thin and still be insulin resistant and still be heading your way into all of those things. So this is the real crisis that we're looking at. And, our administration needs to do better on this one, period, or we're not going to make it.
Totally.
Such a positive way.
One of the interesting things that I always tell people, I eat keto for the most part because I want to keep my blood sugars down. I feel terrible. If I'm eating carbohydrates as a diabetic, I'm feeling terrible. But some of us just need more to move that needle on a weight loss spectrum. This is a thing that measures your ketones through your breath. And I just wanted to kind of throw this in there for that person who's like, well, they just need to do this. Because eventually I get just comments of if he would just eat this way or that way, this is measuring my ketones, haven't eaten for a few hours.
Yeah. Better score than I'd get.
Yeah, I have no idea what it'll be, but my point is I'm doing the things I'm supposed to be doing. There's metabolic, things that are not going well in my body that are keeping me from getting to where somebody who would eat the way that I do would, potentially lose weight or maintain their weight or whatever. It's just not as cut and dry as people want to make it, for sure.
It's not. And it could have been the parents you were born to. It could have been a toxic exposure in your childhood. It could have been a toxic exposure in your adolescence. It could have been, dare I say, a medication or something you were exposed to along the way medically. It could have been a lot of things. And it could be chronic stress. It could be my metabolic health is in shambles when my stress is high. My labs look atrocious. And it's concerning that stress has that much of an impact, so we have to throw people a bone. And I always have a rule when patients come in, I deal a lot with pain predominantly. And when patients would come in and say, doc, I have this horrific pain and blah, 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 and no one believes me. And I'm like, it is not my job to judge how hard you're trying or not to get out of pain or how bad your pain is. Your subjective life is subjective. It's not my job to judge the pain level. It's my job to help you. And I feel the same way with the patients I've helped with obesity. I've helped a lot of them. It is not my job to judge what they're doing right or wrong. It's my job to help them. I can only lead them to water. But if I were back in my big practice with the big numbers of patients I was seeing a day, I would have a large portion of them do a trial of a GLP-1. I can honestly say that. It is that profound for pain and for metabolic dysfunction, which are tied together, right? So I just think that we're missing the trees through the forest, or whatever the forest through the trees. I think everyone's so hung up on whether people who are obese are just being lazy that they're missing the opportunity here that we can really help people if more doctors and more politicians and more people in charge would actually learn about these peptides appropriately. So I invite RFK for a conversation anytime, because I would love to have a conversation with him.
Yes.
I would be happy to share all my data with him. He's a smart man.
Yeah,
Okay, Dave. Well, where can everyone find you? Because I don't want to keep you all day. I know you've got some sick kiddos you got to take care of.
Yeah. So first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here on your platform and share. Thank you so much for having me. If people want to find the news, if GLP-1 news like these lawsuits on compounds or whatever new is coming down the pike with anti-obesity medication, onthepen.com is a great rallying point. From there, you can find me on literally all the socials. I'm at Man on the Manjaro, but if you just do a Google search for On the Pen, you'll see my little logo, this little guy. Man on the Moonjaro is a play of Man on the Moon. So if you see that anywhere, that's probably me, or it's an imposter, and they'll have at least some of my account content on their imposter account. But yeah, at Man on the Moonjaro pretty much everywhere. TikTok and YouTube are home base for me.
Okay. And it's so good. You guys go follow. We'll make sure everything's in the show notes for you to grab hold, and make sure you go follow Dave Knapp, because truly you're doing God's work, and you're just an independent journalist here that it sounds like you didn't really sign up for this. It sort of found you. So these are the missions we go on. Right. Anything else? Anything I didn't hit on that you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think we covered so much here. There's much more to be said. We have our own podcast called On the Pen, the Weekly Dose, that you can listen to if you want the weekly tidbits of news that come out. And we do a show that you were actually just on, a Thursday night live show that gets uploaded to the podcast too. We cover everything there. I think for anyone, my heart specifically goes out to people who use these medications that feel like they can't share that experience with their loved ones. That's really, where my heart is. That's why I wrote the book, Decoding GLP-1. I've made it very inexpensive by design because I want people to be able to get it. And if for some reason, even the $10 cost is a barrier for people, I don't want it to be. If this can be helpful for you to pass it on to a loved one who's, just think of that aunt or grandma in your life who's like, you're not on one of those shots, are you? You're going to get thyroid cancer. This book is for them. It's very digestible. And I hope that people will check it out, because I think it has the power to really transform those relationships. And I, once again, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Yeah. And I bought your book. I wanted to support you. So I hope that my listeners will do the same too, because you are working really hard on this. And like I said, you're doing God's work. Well, thank you, Dave Knapp. I will make sure everyone goes to onthepen.com. I so appreciate your insight and time. And you'll have to come back, when we've got more news on what's happening as things unfold, and we'll have you back on the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Dr. Tina Show. This is a Wellness Loud production produced by Drake Peterson and mixed by Mike Fry. Theme song is by John the Guilt. You can watch the full video version of this podcast inside the Spotify app or on YouTube. As always, you can email the podcast at podcast@drtyna.com. That's DRTYNA. And if you like this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. You can also find all of my offerings on my website at drtyna.com. For more shows by my team, go to wellnessloud.com. See you next time, and thanks for listening. This podcast is for general informational purposes only. It does not constitute the practices of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. I am a doctor, but I am not your doctor. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and the materials linked to this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content on this podcast is intended not to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice from any medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.